You think you know ancient Rome, the grandeur of its emperors, the might of its legions, the architectural marvels that still inspire awe. But beneath the polished marble and the epic tales of conquest lay a vast, unseen world, a sprawling empire built not just on ambition and steel, but on the systematic commodification of human flesh. This was the silent, brutal reality for countless individuals, bought and sold, their very bodies reduced to property, existing solely to satisfy the desires of their owners. If the untold, darker corners of history ignite your curiosity, the stories deliberately obscured by the victors, then join this exploration. Subscribe for more deep dives, share your insights in the comments, and tell me where in the world you're confronting these truths. The Roman Empire, at its zenith, was a society utterly dependent on slave labor. This dependency was not merely economic. It was the very bedrock of Roman civilization, allowing citizens to pursue leisure, politics, and military glory, while a vast underclass toiled ceaselessly beneath them. Estimates vary, but by the 1st century CE, as much as 30 to 40% of Italy's population, and significant portions across the provinces, were enslaved. These millions were not simply laborers in fields or mines, though those brutalized sectors certainly consumed countless lives. Slaves permeated every level of Roman life, from the highest echelons of imperial households to the meanest urban hovel. They were architects, teachers, doctors, highly skilled artisans, record keepers, personal secretaries, entertainers, and domestic servants, forming the invisible engine that drove society. Crucially, they were also a primary source of sexual gratification and entertainment, a truth often overlooked but integral to their existence. Their omnipresence meant that almost every aspect of Roman daily life, from the food on the table to the literature read, was touched by the invisible, often suffering, hands of the enslaved. The acquisition of slaves was a ceaseless process, fueling Rome's insatiable demands for human resources. This constant influx was primarily driven by military conquest, as Rome's legions swept across the known world, enslaving entire populations of defeated peoples. Piracy also provided a steady, brutal supply, with captives from coastal regions and distant seas sold into bondage in bustling port cities. Beyond these external sources, widespread debt slavery, the abandonment of unwanted children, and the natural reproduction within slave households, particularly for those born into servitude, verni, ensured a self-sustaining and ever-growing cycle of human chattel. As Rome's empire expanded, so did its human property, a constant stream of diverse peoples from across the known world: Gauls, Greeks, Egyptians, Britons, Germans, Africans, all forcibly displaced. They were stripped of their former identities, their languages, their cultures, and reduced to disposable property, their individual narratives silenced. They became nameless faces, their origins often a mere footnote in their valuation, their former lives utterly erased the moment they crossed the threshold of bondage, subjected to an institutionalized dehumanization that permeated every aspect of their existence. The Roman legal system, famously intricate and comprehensive, provided meticulous regulations for this human trade, codifying the absolute power of owners. Slaves were not merely possessions. They were legally defined as res, things or property, and their lives were governed by a vast body of laws that afforded them virtually no rights against their owners. They could not marry legally, own property, or testify in court. They were classified, branded, and marketed like any other commodity at bustling forums and specialized slave markets. Their price fluctuated based on a myriad of factors: age, skill, health, and their origin, with certain ethnicities perceived as more intelligent or docile, often commanding higher prices. Beauty, and frequently, virginity were paramount considerations, particularly for young women and boys destined for sexual servitude. For these most vulnerable individuals, youth, physical attractiveness, and an assumed innocence commanded the highest prices, creating a predatory market that preyed upon the desperation of parents, the spoils of war, and the systematic exploitation of human beings. This created a chilling hierarchy of commodification, where the most desirable attributes translated directly into greater risk and deeper degradation. This wasn't merely an unfortunate byproduct of war or a historical quirk. It was an integral, deliberate economic engine powering Roman society, a shadow economy that thrived on the degradation of human beings. The sheer scale and systematic nature of Roman slavery distinguished it, transforming human lives into tradable assets that underpinned everything from grand public works to the most intimate private pleasures. Every Roman citizen, regardless of status, tacitly or actively participated in this system, either as an owner, a consumer of services rendered by slaves, or simply by benefiting from its pervasive presence in the form of cheap goods and abundant labor. The very concept of Roman liberty, so proudly proclaimed by its citizens, was, in a chilling paradox, predicated upon the absolute denial of liberty to millions, creating a moral abyss at the heart of their celebrated civilization. This vast, silent army of the exploited sustained the Roman way of life, its unseen hands shaping the empire's grandeur, its unseen suffering fueling its appetites, especially its most intimate and illicit demands. It was this constant, carefully managed trade in human flesh that continually restocked the ranks of those who would serve in myriad ways, including the brothels and private chambers that dotted the empire's cities, where the most vulnerable faced their darkest realities. Within the sprawling urban centers of the Roman Empire, particularly in Rome itself and port cities like Pompeii, the lupinar, the brothel, was a ubiquitous and legally recognized institution. These establishments ranged from squalid, windowless cells in alleyways, barely more than crevices in the urban labyrinth, to more elaborate, if still stark, multi-room structures built specifically for the purpose. Far from being discreet, they were distinct from the homes of respectable Roman women, often overtly marked by explicit frescoes depicting sexual acts on their exterior walls, or by carved phalluses pointing towards the entrance, boldly advertising the services within. These were not hidden corners of vice, but integral, if often grim, components of the Roman economic and social landscape, sanctioned by law and woven into the fabric of daily life. Their presence a constant, visible testament to the empire's pervasive commodification of human sexuality. For the vast majority of sex slaves, the lupinar was their prison, a permanent confinement that mirrored the legal definition of their very being as res, mere property. Here, life was a relentless cycle of exploitation, a meticulously managed system of human commodification. Women, and often young men, frequently purchased at slave markets or born into servitude, were owned and managed by a leno or lena brothel keeper. These keepers, often former slaves themselves who had gained their freedom, or ambitious free citizens seeking profit from human misery, exercised absolute authority. Their primary concern was profit, viewing their human inventory as perishable assets to be utilized to their fullest extent before their value diminished. They oversaw every aspect of their charges' lives, from their meals to their forced sexual labor, enforcing a brutal discipline to ensure maximum compliance and productivity. The first step in their systematic dehumanization was often the stripping away of their birth names, replaced instead with generic, sexually suggestive monikers like Lysiska, the she-wolf, Myrtalis, Myrtle, Electra, or Dionysia, further severing their ties to any former identity and reducing them to archetypes of sexual availability. They wore minimal clothing, often coarse tunics or simple cloaks, sometimes even branded or tattooed with specific marks to explicitly denote their status as publicly available property, perpetually ready for display and consumption. This deliberate effacement of personal identity served to reinforce their status as disposable objects, a blank canvas upon which client desires could be projected without the messy interference of individual personhood. The conditions within these establishments were uniformly harsh, designed for function rather than comfort, and certainly not for human dignity. Hygiene was rudimentary at best, a perpetual battle lost against the realities of shared spaces, unwashed bodies, and constant bodily fluids. Access to clean water was limited, often necessitating the reuse of washing water or forcing slaves to rely on communal basins that only spread contagion. Latrine facilities were primitive, often open pits or rudimentary troughs, contributing to an overpowering stench that permeated the entire structure. Disease was rampant, a silent killer often claiming lives prematurely. Fevers, venereal infections, such as syphilis or gonorrhea, though not understood scientifically as we know them today, festering sores, urinary tract infections, chronic respiratory ailments from poor ventilation, and a litany of other debilitating conditions were the constant companions of brothel slaves. Medical attention was virtually non-existent, beyond the most basic, often ineffective, herbal remedies or superstitious rituals, offering little solace or cure. The suffering was continuous, a constant ache of the body worn down by toil and illness. The threat of violence permeated every moment, not only from drunken, crude, or sadistic clients who viewed these bodies as their absolute right to brutalize, verbally abuse, or physically assault with impunity, but also from frustrated, cruel, or financially motivated owners who administered beatings, lashings, and other excruciating punishments as a means of control and to enforce absolute obedience. These punishments were often public within the lupinar, serving as grim lessons to others. The power dynamics were stark. A slave's life and body held no legal protection against their owner's whims, making their existence a terrifying tightrope walk of survival, where any infraction, real or imagined, could lead to unimaginable pain. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii, with its remarkably preserved brothels, paints a vivid and chilling picture of this reality. Visitors can walk through the narrow, oppressive corridors and peer into the small, cramped rooms, each barely large enough for a single stone bed platform, often covered with a thin mattress or straw for some semblance of comfort. These cells, often without windows, were dark, stifling in summer and freezing in winter, the stone absorbing the extremes of temperature. They were permeated by the inescapable, cloying smells of sweat, cheap oil lamps, human waste, stale wine, and unwashed bodies, a suffocating miasma that clung to every surface. The air was thick with the echoes of muffled sounds from adjacent cells, a constant reminder of the intimate indignities being perpetrated. Graffiti etched into the walls by clients offer crude boasts, declarations of fleeting desire, or explicit details of services received, while carved lists of services and prices serve as a stark reminder of the purely transactional nature of the encounters taking place. These were not places of glamour or illicit romance, but highly functional sites of systematic abuse, meticulously designed for the efficient exploitation of human beings. Every architectural detail, the small size, the hard surfaces, the lack of privacy, the indelible marks on the walls, every preserved inscription speaks to an institutionalized degradation that left no room for individual will, self-respect, or resistance. The very design of the lupinar was a physical manifestation of the dehumanization enacted within its walls, a chillingly efficient machine for turning human bodies into transient pleasure. A sex slave had no rights over their own body. The concept of consent was entirely absent from their existence, legally and practically. Their day-to-day survival hinged entirely on their ability to appease clients, to anticipate and deflect aggression, to avoid beatings from their keepers, and to endure the endless parade of strangers with as little damage as possible. It was a constant performance of subservience, a psychological tightrope walk where any misstep, a perceived defiance, a moment of exhaustion, a client's dissatisfaction, could lead to further brutal suffering. They learned to become experts in reading human nature, masters of emotional suppression, and actors in their own debasement, their internal world a fortress against the constant assault on their dignity. Escape was virtually impossible within the confines of a heavily surveilled city. Slave catchers, often equipped with dogs, were constantly on patrol, and punishment for attempting it was brutally severe, often involving branding, maiming, or public crucifixion as a gruesome warning to others. For a sex slave, every moment was a desperate negotiation with their own suffering, a continuous, draining attempt to retain some fragment of self, some last ember of individuality, in an environment designed to systematically dismantle and annihilate it. They existed as living embodiments of the Roman moral abyss, their freedom denied to fuel the most intimate and illicit appetites of the empire, publicly available and endlessly consumed, their very visibility a testament to their profound degradation. Beyond the lupinar, a more insidious form of sexual slavery thrived within the private households of Rome's elite. Wealthy Romans, from senators to successful merchants, but also influential equestrians, prominent philosophers, and even high-ranking military commanders, often owned hundreds, sometimes thousands, of slaves. Among this vast retinue, individuals chosen for sexual purposes occupied a particularly ambiguous and dangerous position. While brothel slaves were publicly identifiable and their degradation institutionalized, those within wealthy homes existed in a shadow world, their exploitation cloaked by domesticity and the outward appearance of service. This made their suffering uniquely isolating, a silent torment unseen by the broader public and largely unacknowledged by the legal codes that supposedly governed societal norms. These individuals, both male and female, often referred to by euphemistic terms like delicia, darlings, pueri delicati, delicate boys, or simply favorite servants, were not explicitly branded or openly advertised as prostitutes. Yet, their bodies were just as thoroughly, and often more intimately, at the complete disposal of their masters, and sometimes their mistresses. The very notion of consent was not only absent, but entirely inconceivable within this power dynamic. Their sexual availability was an intrinsic, unquestioned facet of their commodified existence, a perk of ownership woven into the intricate fabric of the elite Roman household. Their training might extend beyond mere household duties to include sophisticated social graces, music, poetry, or even philosophical discourse, transforming them into cultivated companions whose intellect was meant to enhance their sexual appeal and conversational value, further blurring the lines between companionship and exploitation. Unlike brothel slaves, their lives could appear superficially more comfortable. They might receive better food, finer clothing, and even a semblance of education, perhaps tutored in Greek, music, or rhetoric to make them more engaging companions and more refined objects of desire. They resided within opulent villas, surrounded by frescoes, sculptures, and lush gardens, a gilded cage designed to cultivate their allure. Their bodies were often meticulously cared for, anointed with expensive oils and adorned in silks, not for their own comfort or vanity, but as an investment, enhancing their value and appeal to their owner and his guests. However, this apparent privilege came with an even greater, more pervasive psychological burden: the constant, inescapable proximity to their abusers. This close-quarter living, intended to serve the master's whims, paradoxically intensified the psychological trauma. There was no physical or temporal escape from their master's gaze, no anonymous street to vanish into after a degrading encounter, no defined working hours after which they could retreat into a communal, if squalid, space. Their every movement, every moment, was potentially under surveillance by not only the master, but also by watchful overseers or even jealous fellow slaves. A master could demand sexual services at any time, day or night, in any part of the household, whether in private chambers, a secluded garden nook, or even during lavish banquets as a display of power. This total impunity, rooted in the legal concept of dominium, absolute ownership, created a climate of perpetual fear and anxiety that permeated every aspect of their existence. A slave's physical safety, emotional well-being, and even their very survival were entirely dependent on the often capricious, cruel, or even sadistic whims of their owner. The utter unpredictability of these demands fostered a profound sense of helplessness, systematically eroding any illusion of personal space, bodily autonomy, or psychological security. Female household slaves, in particular, were intensely vulnerable to the sexual advances of their masters. Such encounters frequently led to unwanted pregnancies, a biological reality that complicated the master-slave relationship in profound ways. For the slave woman, pregnancy could bring temporary respite from immediate sexual demands, but it also carried significant health risks in an era of rudimentary medicine and the ultimate, agonizing certainty that her child would be born into the same inescapable servitude. The legal principle of partus sequitur ventrem, the offspring follows the womb, ensured that children born of a slave mother and a free father remained slaves, perpetuating the cycle of exploitation across generations. For the master, these children could be both a source of familial pride and a logistical burden, sometimes quietly sold off, other times kept as a visible testament to his power and indiscretion. Occasionally, some masters, motivated by affection, pity, or social ambition, especially if the child bore a striking resemblance and could serve as a valuable companion, acknowledged these offspring. This might lead to a slight improvement in the child's status, perhaps being raised alongside freeborn children, receiving a better education, or performing less arduous labor within the household. However, true manumission, the act of freeing a slave, for these alumni, foster children, was exceedingly rare and often came with substantial strings attached. A former slave might be freed only to remain economically dependent on their former master, tied by intricate obligations that still amounted to a de facto servitude, or forced into a binding patronage relationship that limited their true autonomy. Furthermore, the indelible stigma of their birth and status as a former slave, particularly one born of sexual exploitation, followed them throughout their lives, a social brand more enduring than any physical mark, restricting their social mobility and opportunities for honorable marriage. For male slaves, particularly beautiful young men, pueri delicati, the situation was equally perilous, though perceived differently within Roman society's complex sexual landscape. While Roman society generally disapproved of free adult men adopting a feminine sexual role, i.e., being the penetrated partner, it readily accepted the sexual use of male slaves, regardless of their age or willingness. This seemingly contradictory attitude was resolved through the prevailing power dynamic. The act was not seen as a reflection on the free man's masculinity, which remained intact as long as he maintained the active role, but merely an exercise of his dominance and entitlement over property. The passive role, deemed shameful if performed by a free citizen, was simply another indignity for the enslaved, an expected part of their subservience. These pueri delicati were highly prized commodities, often purchased at exorbitant prices in slave markets, trained in various arts, and expected to serve not only sexually, but also as companions, entertainers, and even confidants. Their exquisite beauty and youthful innocence became both their currency and their curse. They existed in a constant state of performance, their emotional labor as vital as their physical compliance. They had to be charming, witty, aesthetically pleasing, and above all, endlessly available and compliant. Any perceived sulkiness, defiance, or lack of enthusiasm could be met with severe punishment, not just from the master, but potentially from the master's wife, who might view them as rivals, a threat to her social standing, or simply a convenient target for her own frustrations. The silent rivalry within the household, especially with a matrona who resented her husband's indiscretions, added another layer of constant tension and danger to their already precarious existence. The psychological impact on these individuals was profound and devastating. They lived in a gilded cage, trapped by their very attributes, their beauty, their youth, their perceived value, which paradoxically ensured their continuous violation. Their sense of self was systematically eroded by the continuous demands on their body and spirit, the complete absence of any personal autonomy, and the constant pressure to suppress their true feelings. They learned to wear masks of contentment, indifference, or even manufactured affection, becoming skilled actors in their own debasement. Their identity was fractured, their inner world a battleground where any remaining shred of individuality fought against the crushing weight of their role. Their value lay entirely in their body, a brutal dehumanization that stripped them of dignity, self-worth, and identity, even amidst the most opulent surroundings of Rome's wealthiest households. Their hidden lives were a testament to silent suffering, a chilling counterpoint to the vibrant public life of the Roman elite, a constant quiet tragedy unfolding behind closed doors that the bustling city chose not to acknowledge. This insidious form of sexual servitude represented the deepest penetration of Roman moral hypocrisy, where the closest bonds of domesticity were perverted into instruments of systematic, inescapable exploitation. Roman society grappled with a complex and often contradictory attitude towards sexuality and those who engaged in it for payment. While brothels and prostitution were legal, and the sexual exploitation of slaves was an accepted norm, respectable citizens were expected to maintain a careful distance from such activities, at least publicly. Those who sold their bodies, whether free or enslaved, were subjected to infamia, a legal and social stigma that stripped them of many civil rights. This wasn't merely social disapproval. Infamia was a formal legal disability, a mark indelibly stamped upon an individual that rendered them fundamentally lesser in the eyes of the law and their fellow citizens. It meant they could not hold public office, serve in the legions, vote in assemblies, or even act as witnesses in court cases, effectively silencing their voices within the civic sphere. They were also barred from certain religious rites, deemed ritually impure, thus completing their marginalization across political, military, and spiritual dimensions of Roman life. This systematic application of infamia created a permanent underclass, reinforcing the idea that such individuals were morally tainted, their bodies, once used for public gratification, now considered irrevocably polluted. This legal disenfranchisement ensured that those forced into, or driven to, commercial sex had no legitimate path to social ascent or political redress. Their economic desperation was further cemented by their lack of civic standing, trapping many in a perpetual cycle where the only means of survival often remained the very activities that had earned them their degrading status. The stigma, however, applied primarily to the active public role of the prostitute, meretrix, or male prostitute, pathicus, the one who offered their body for money. It did not extend to the client, nor to the master who exploited his slaves. The double standard was stark and profoundly revealing of Roman patriarchal values. A Roman citizen could freely engage in sexual acts with slaves or prostitutes without incurring infamia or moral reproach, as long as he maintained a dominant, active role and did not allow himself to be penetrated, which was considered unmanly, effeminatus, and shameful. This was a crucial distinction. Roman masculinity, virilitas, was defined by control, penetration, and social dominance. As long as a free man upheld this ideal in his sexual encounters, his status remained unchallenged, his reputation untarnished. His actions were not judged by inherent morality, but by their conformity to the hierarchical power dynamics that underpinned Roman society. The very act of engaging with an infamous person reaffirmed the citizen's superior status, rather than diminishing it. For free Roman women, the situation was different, yet equally illustrative of the double standard. While they were not subjected to infamia for engaging with slaves or prostitutes, their chastity and adherence to marital fidelity were paramount for their social standing. A free Roman woman who engaged in illicit sexual activity risked severe social censure, divorce, and the loss of her reputation, though not the same legal infamia as a public prostitute. However, within the elite households, some powerful matroni were known to keep pueri delicati, or engage in sexual relationships with their male slaves. These were private transgressions, often cloaked in secrecy, the consequences for the mistress stemming from the violation of social norms and the potential for public scandal, rather than a codified legal degradation equivalent to that faced by the enslaved or free prostitute. The law, while unequivocally recognizing slaves as property, chattel with no inherent rights of their own, also contained curious provisions that sometimes inadvertently highlighted their humanity. While a master possessed dominium, absolute ownership over his slaves, there were theoretical, albeit rarely enforced, mechanisms for slaves to report extreme cruelty. For instance, the lex patronia, though its precise date and scope are debated, aimed to prevent masters from forcing slaves to fight wild beasts without official consent. Later, under emperors like Hadrian and Antoninus Pius, laws were introduced that allowed slaves to seek protection from unusually severe cruelty, particularly if it was deemed to go beyond the bounds of reasonable punishment or was inflicted by a master, not their owner. However, these legal avenues were fraught with impossible difficulties for a slave. Accessing legal counsel was virtually unheard of, the act of reporting itself incredibly dangerous, and the burden of proof insurmountable against a powerful master. Such reports were consequently rare, often ignored, or met with brutal retribution, proving to be little more than a thin veneer of compassion over a system built on total subjugation. Even the prospect of manumission, the act of freeing a slave, for sex slaves rarely meant true freedom from their past. For many, it was a transition from overt bondage to a more insidious form of dependence. Now technically independent, these libertini freed people often found themselves with few marketable skills beyond those associated with their former exploitation. Their economic precarity frequently compelled them to continue working as prostitutes or entertainers, sometimes still under the de facto control of their former owners, who now acted as patrons. The patron-client relationship, a cornerstone of Roman society, could be particularly coercive for a freed sex slave, with intricate obligations of service and loyalty that amounted to a prolonged economic servitude. Furthermore, the indelible stigma of their birth and status as a former slave, particularly one born of sexual exploitation, followed them throughout their lives. This social brand was more enduring than any physical mark, restricting their opportunities for honorable marriage, professional advancement, and genuine integration into respectable Roman society. They remained on the periphery, forever marked by their past. These interconnected legal and social mechanisms, the imposition of infamia, the stark double standard, the largely ineffective legal protections, and the limited nature of manumission, created a self-perpetuating cycle of exploitation. Roman law, rather than ameliorating the conditions of those engaged in commercial sex, actively sanctioned the conditions that created this stigmatized underclass, and then, paradoxically, enforced their degradation. It was a system designed to fulfill the desires of the privileged without compromising their perceived moral standing, transferring all social and legal opprobrium onto the exploited. The legal ironies of Roman sexuality underscore a society wrestling not with its appetites, but with its public image and internal contradictions. It established clear, rigid boundaries for citizens, dictating what was honorable and what was shameful, yet simultaneously created a vast infrastructure of human exploitation to fulfill desires that its own moral codes deemed illicit if performed by free individuals. This profound hypocrisy allowed the elite to navigate a complex sexual landscape, satisfying their needs through the bodies of those deemed without civic worth, thereby maintaining a public facade of virtue. The result was a pervasive system where human beings were simultaneously indispensable for the functioning of society's illicit desires and utterly dehumanized by its laws and social conventions. A stark, chilling paradox at the heart of the Roman world, where the illusion of order was built upon the systematic degradation of human beings. The legacy of Roman sex slavery is not merely a historical footnote. It is a profound testament to humanity's capacity for systemic cruelty and the enduring resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable degradation. For centuries, countless individuals lived and died within this brutal institution, their lives reduced to a transactional existence, their bodies owned, their voices silenced by the sheer weight of Roman law and social custom. The psychological scars inflicted by such an existence would have been immeasurable. Victims were forced to suppress their own desires, their personalities, and their very sense of self to survive. They learned to navigate a world where physical pain and emotional torment were constant companions, where trust was a luxury they could not afford, and where hope was often a dangerous illusion. The reverberations of this systemic abuse extended far beyond the immediate victims. It shaped Roman society itself, normalizing the objectification of bodies and reinforcing a brutal hierarchy where power was intrinsically linked to the ability to exploit. It contributed to the erosion of empathy, creating a culture where a significant portion of the population was viewed as interchangeable commodities, devoid of inherent worth. Even as the Roman Empire eventually declined, and later Christian societies slowly dismantled overt slavery, the echoes of this dehumanization persisted. The concept of a human being as property, of a body as a tool for another's gratification, left an indelible stain on the fabric of Western civilization. The hidden lives of ancient courtesans and sex slaves remind us that the grand narratives of empire often conceal profound human tragedies. Their stories, pieced together from fragmented legal texts, archaeological findings, and the veiled references of Roman writers, force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that even the most advanced societies can build their glories upon the systematic destruction of human dignity. It is a chilling reminder of the fragility of moral boundaries when power is unchecked and human lives become mere instruments for others' desires. The stark reality of Rome's sex slaves challenges our romanticized notions of antiquity, stripping away the grandeur to reveal a profound darkness. Their story is a chilling testament to the price of unchecked power and the systematic dehumanization that can fester at the heart of even the greatest empires. May we never forget the lessons these hidden lives teach us about the true cost of civilization when moral boundaries are sacrificed to convenience and appetite. Thank you for confronting this difficult history with me.